Okay, Armada is another one where I don't have much to show you in terms of, it's another S&T magazine from my fairly early era of play. Within the first couple of years that I got into the hobby is when I picked it up. It probably predates my entry by my figuring, even if the date is the one that I've magically said is after one that where I started playing. I think I'm mistaken in that. We've discussed that already before. Now, most war games focus on simulating the military aspects of a campaign or whatever. Armada doesn't do that really. The military is very, very abstracted. Sure, you got your CRT, but it's a very simple one. It doesn't really feel as though the combat results are terribly, taking into account any kind of differences in the philosophies of the two countries, either land or naval. It's just strength points fighting strength points. Even with the ships, it really is, with step losses thrown in. It's all kind of a mishmash there of techniques that are used in other games, maybe with better effect, but here it doesn't really feel like they are. Where this does seem to focus is on the logistics side of things. Now, there are games like OCS that focus on logistics, and they're very interesting. There are big strategic games, and this almost fits into that focus more on your production choices. You have a lot of those here. This does fit more into that Europa Universalis without all the cool stuff type of game, or even in Empires and Arms. The military system is maybe less detailed, but not tremendously so than either of those games. Mainly because it's just a CRT instead of a firepower table. Firepower tables are nice. I tend to really like them. But you do have to make your choices of what you're going to spend your money on in this, and it's the job as paymaster of the Imperial or Royal fleet that you're really serving the role of more than anything else. Yes, you also are making these big strategic decisions of which to take. Unfortunately, those big strategic decisions are probably take up less of your thought and energy than does counting up where to get, how to get all your hulls into the right ports, or, well, if I build these forces, can I pay for them over the course of the year? And can I pay for the military campaigns that I have to? And that's what this game is all about. It's about counting and, to some extent, outguessing your opponent in terms of what you're prepared for, what kind of campaign you're prepared for. I don't find that terribly interesting to play, to tell you the truth. It is more interesting opposed, by far, and that's why I had it at a slightly higher rating. And now I'm kind of averaging it in because how often am I going to play Armada opposed? Well, maybe as much as anything else. I could definitely see getting my wife to play this. I've gotten friends to play it before because it's an interesting topic. And that's what's really the shame here, is this is such an interesting period and there's so little in it. I mean, what do you actually have? You have the EU that I mentioned, which has at least one scenario covering this area. And then you have Virgin Queen, which gives you sort of this, non-war game, but like, well, by my book, but very, very high-level abstracted political card game with a board and troops and stuff moving around on it that contains this. But that's at about the same level as playing, say, all of EU, which I'm not sure is a war game either, except who else would possibly play it except war gamers. I can see my old group playing Virgin Queen. my old group that consisted maybe 50% wargame or 50% people who would not play war games, no matter how much you told them they would enjoy it. If you told them it was a war game, they would say no, and they wouldn't touch this. They wouldn't touch EU, they wouldn't touch Empires in Arms, but they would touch something like, here I see Anniversary. Anyway, we're getting way off topic here as usual. Everything about this game is a little lackluster. The graphics of the board, this is a Simonson game. Well, they're plain. All you have on it is the national coloration, which is a little garish for my taste. I would rather something more subdued if that's all we're going to have. It would be nice if there was some terrain, some military aspect to it. The actual play decisions, which often come down to a combat system which is relatively mild in terms of its effect. A few step losses on the land table. The naval combat, a few step losses per pulse of it. It almost works out like a firepower type table in terms of you have lots of options to get away from the combat if you don't like it. If you have big stacks facing each other, you're not going to see people wiped out. On the other hand, if you have smaller forces facing each other, they can be completely wiped out, which means it's important to have big stacks with small forces to take your losses, which is weird. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but, well, I can almost excuse that, except, well, no, I guess the Netherlands is handled fairly well with the fortifications because you can have your big stack drive away anything that is kind of besieging your forces if your big stack is big enough. The win table is very, very random, and I think it should be. I'm not debating it for that in particular, although I don't like the fact that it doesn't matter how big your stack is. You will take X number of step losses from the wind. That does not feel at all natural. But it does make sense that the wind has very wildly differing results. However, that means the game often comes down to a crapshoot, which is okay to me, but I can see a lot of people really disliking that. The combat results tables also are very high in the luck influence on the game, and they feel a little duller. In fact, it's hard to find something that doesn't feel terribly dull in this game unless you really, really like trying to optimize where your ships are going to go, or optimizing your pay schedules, and these are important factors in the campaign. There's no question about that. This is the kind of stuff that probably gave Philip II nightmares, and he probably spent all his nights working hard on it. It's just, Philip II's life is not one that I want to emulate. This is too much work and effort for the payoff that it comes out for me, and that's what it comes out to be. But it is not as bad if you play it opposed. That's definitely a point in its favor. It's also, there's a certain fun aspect to you can really create sort of this pure plan in your mind and test it out. And it's not a terribly long game. I told them to update it in the database to 8 hours. I'm not sure it should be 8 hours, but I know what it was at. 2 hours is way too optimistic. Probably it lands around 4, with a large part of that being calculating and balancing to figure out how many troops you can actually put on the board, etc. This is not a game where you can just guess those kind of numbers. It is very unforgiving to you if you screw up. If you get too many troops in England and you can't pay for them, well, look, there goes, a value of victory points equal to capturing London. away from your national value. And in some senses, that's perfectly reasonable. Again, I'm not gonna hark on it on historical grounds. It's just the choices of the things to focus the historical reality on in this game are bizarre, to say the least. They're not what wargamers usually want, and I think that's a big part of why this thing is not going to have a good rating, right? Although most people complain about the rules set, and quite frankly, I do not find the rules set that terrible. It's on par with kind of the worst of the S&T games in terms of, you know, how clear it is, how unambiguous it is. It's not unplayable without this. I've never seen the second edition, so I have no idea how playable or unplayable that is, whether that's just an incorporation of these few rules. Few. It looks huge, right? It's a whole page. Ooh. Not quite at the same font that the rules are at, a little larger. People talk about it as, oh, it's as many differences as there are rules themselves. No. It's a fairly significant set of errata, most of which you don't need. There are a couple of key points in there, though, and there's at least one that changes something significantly enough in the game, I remember, but I may be wrong. I seem to think that I'm wrong about that. Yeah, I was wrong about that. Yeah. So for the most part, you don't need these. They're pretty much implied by the rules. It would take, I think, someone with a particularly perverse mind to misinterpret these rules to the extent that they didn't come up with what's more or less in the errata. There is one difference of significant import, which is the activation values on the map being wrong. Those have a significant impact on play if you don't have that. The game's playable without them. You'll just not be able to build as many ships. And I played it without them, essentially, the first part of the game. There are some things that are a little fuzzy, whether or not you have the errata, but that's okay. If you compare it to stuff that, say, came out in, I'm trying to think, some of the later S&Ts or Wargamers, back when other companies took them over, this is just infinitely better. You know, some of those games would come out without whole sections of the rules, and you'd be like, what am I playing? I'm thinking Campaigns of Marlborough here. That had a real problem, if I recall correctly. Good game. Real problem with the rules. SPI was pretty good. I mean, if this is the worst they managed, and I've seen people quoting it as the worst rulebook ever that they've seen, well, you guys are really, really leading sheltered lives if this is the worst you've seen. Because this is playable. It takes some effort to boil it down, maybe, if you don't have the errata, but not much. I was able to read it, skim it again after, 10 years or whatever, and I more or less remembered it, but it's pretty easy. And it follows most standards. What's wrong here is the game itself, for me. It's too much of a pain in the ass to count up my factors to see if they all fit in the ports. That's a big one. Projecting whether or not I can make it through the year without going bankrupt. That's really tough. You really have to kind of add up everything and multiply it out over the course of the turn. And then you can kind of throw a fudge factor in because you're going to lose some units maybe. But for the most part, you're trying to balance, you're trying to do your taxes in advance before you have your income and expenditures. It's really kind of like that. You're trying to guesstimate your taxes ahead of time, and that's fine. But that's just not what I want to play. And there are no play aids to help you figure that out. Now, granted, the calculations aren't terribly difficult, but they're counting, and I don't like counting. rather just be doing the multiplication, the addition. The counting for the Navy slots are particularly hard. Other than that, there's not really a lot to say. There's a lot, there's a lot of luck that comes down to it. It could be decisive luck. I'm worried that it's not balanced, which is to say that I'm worried that, okay, prior to this play, it felt like the English always won. This time the Spanish won. Can they be stopped? Certainly. I can project and think of how they could be stopped. I can't think of a way to prevent them from landing in Ireland or Western Britain. And that's a problem to me. Because even if you engage them in naval combat, you may not win. Even if you have the advantage, you may not defeat them decisively enough to prevent them from getting across. But the big thing is you can't guarantee an interception unless you break your English fleet up. And if you break your English fleet up, I don't think you can win the naval battle, even though historically they did. It turned into a running battle and the rest of the fleet joined. There's no rules to cover that kind of detail. The only real detail in this game is your counting and your paymaster duties. Which, again, that's not really why I'm into wargaming. I'm left with kind of the wondering if this is really a war game or a logistics game. You could say the same about other things, but unlike the other games, this one just does not do a lot of, it doesn't handle the combat aspects in enough simulative detail that I feel like I'm really playing something that's a real war game. It's got hexes, it's got counters, it's got different combat factors, all that. How much do you want of a war game? I mean, if it didn't have the economic side, I guess it would have to be. And the economic side is derived towards a military operation and nothing else. So what else is this? But the focus of this game is definitely very different from most war games. And overall, it's sort of a below average game to me. I've still given it a 6 because I think there's some fun to be had in it when you're playing it opposed. But I mean, I had given it a higher rating before, and I don't know why that was the case. I must have enjoyed something about it. But the decisions that you make at the very beginning of the game may just seal your fate very early. And if they don't, if you've made reasonable decisions as the Spaniard, and only the Spaniard, I think, gets to make decisions early on, they get to determine the flow of the game. If you made decent decisions with the Spaniards, it could still come down where an unlucky die roll really hoses you, or a bad guess. So the English could sneak a small fleet in and steal some of your ports because you didn't defend yourself adequately, but you're playing that paymaster role and you've got to choose to cut corners somewhere, right? Anyway, it's not an unplayable game. There's some enjoyment to it. It's just not the enjoyment that I usually am looking for. All right, up it goes.